Let's just try this. Can everybody hear me all right? I have this annoying high school study teacher's voice that never goes away. So let me know if I'm blasting you out too much also, please. I've probably said this any number of times, and so I feel a bit repetitive, but I also feel that I should start tonight by letting you know that in growing up on the southwest side of Chicago in what very well might have been described as a kind of a crucible in the 50s were some of the worst problems that ailed the United States. Believe me, they weren't words we used. Militarism, racism, sexism, but all of that was swirling around in the neighborhood where I grew up. I probably thought the worst problem I faced was that the Clearasil wasn't working, and yet, finally, my conscience did start to form, but it wasn't because the guy sitting next to me was conscripted to go over to Vietnam and might never come back, or it wasn't because the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King had walked through a neighborhood close to mine and somebody who could have been one of my relatives, could have been one of my neighbors, lined a rock at him. Quite honestly, I was a very late bloomer, but I think the grooves for formation of conscience for me came very much from finally starting to read the novels. The novels that were written by people who were so brave, coming out of Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, Russian concentration camps. They picked up their pens and they wrote about their experience, painful though it must have been. And that's what started to form my conscience, because reading those books I kept thinking again and again, I never want to be sitting on my hands in the face of some unspeakable evil. I don't want to be a spectator on the sidelines, and I suppose it was exactly that feeling that came over me almost like a wave when I sat across from Dr. Nafis Abu Shebhem in the burn unit in Gaza City, when he looked at us, and you know, you're used to doctors being kind of cool, calm, and collected. The doctors in Gaza City on that particular day, it was 2 days after the bombing had finally come, at least to a lull, they were shaking. They were having the proverbial meltdown, and there was good reason. They were exhausted. They had worked as teams, vascular surgeons, orthopedic surgeons, and neurosurgeons, trying to save patients and really trying to use whatever methods they could think of on patients suffering wounds they'd never seen before. And they had had blood running on the floors while they had 6 operating tables going and patients dying at their feet. And Dr. Nafis Abu Shebhem, trembling, said to me, "The world watched for 22 days. Governments around the world watched like they were going to the movies. And so that cry that we realized from films like Night and Fog, from novels like The Last of the Just, and anything by Primo Levi or Elie Wiesel, the cry that we heard, 'Never again,' rests in a very, very uneasy position right now as we consider what happened in Gaza." Audrey Stewart, a young mother in her 30s, called me up when we were on about day 5 of a plan that our Chicago lot came up with. We believe in ordeal-oriented events, and we're very good at planning them. We had walked a 450-mile walk over the summer from Chicago up to the Republican National Convention in the August heat, and during the Arctic temperatures of Chicago's winter, the plan was to vigil outdoors for 17 days. So on day 5, shivering 3 blocks away from President Barack Obama's home in Chicago with Camp Hope, Audrey suggested that she, from New Orleans, and possibly our very good friend Bill Quigley, also from New Orleans, might want to go to Gaza. Did I have any connections that I could give them? And I tried to put together the best list I could pull out, and then the next morning, after a good night's sleep, I thought I could go too. And so my good friends, dear friends, helped me clear my schedule, and on January 7th we left from the United States. We arrived in Cairo on January 8th, and we tried for the next week to enter Gaza. It was very difficult. Doctors, medical care specialists that were desperately needed, and drivers of trucks with supplies desperately needed were not getting into Gaza. And we sat on the opposite side of the border, and it was kind of bizarre because you could see these mechanical spies, the drone airplanes, the unmanned aerial vehicles, crisscrossing the skies overhead. And the only way I could kind of liken it to experience that I'm familiar with is if you can imagine the most annoying leaf picker-upper machine you've ever heard. Imagine a day when you were trying to study or read or talk on the phone and this thing was making such a loud buzz you were dying to unplug it. Well, now kind of imagine that flying overhead as a mechanical spy, but when it flies over your head and over your house, it means that the crosshairs are being developed for your house to be hit. And sure enough, we'd see the plume of smoke and hear the explosions from the Egyptian side of the border before we entered Gaza. So if you can imagine that leaf picker-upper machine attacking you. When we went into Gaza, we counted the first night, and once every 11 minutes, a bomb exploded. Ear-splitting blast, sickening thud. And I don't know too much about militarism, but even I could tell after a while they came so frequently, whether it was an Apache helicopter that had been firing a Hellfire missile, or whether it was an F-16 coming in for an attack. Once every 11 minutes was like slow motion, compared to day one of this 22-day assault, which began on December 27th. On that one first day, there were 100 pre-planned targets. The Israeli Air Force, using 88 planes supplied by the United States, hit all 100 targets in 220 seconds. Can you imagine, in minutes, 100 targets hit in a surprise attack? And ultimately 1,423 Gazans were killed, 400 of them children. On the Israeli side, there were 13 people killed, 10 of them military, 3 from friendly fire. And I know that one tie that binds all of us is that we will insist that arms aching for loved ones who will never return, be they Israeli arms, be they Palestinian arms, they are bereaved, and we must feel compassion and the desire to say never again. But I want to return to those doctors at the hospital. It was actually by text message at about 2 o'clock in the morning that Audrey Stewart, with a kind of nifty gizmo, was able to learn that, in fact, the Israelis had decided they'd done enough bombing, that they were going to stop for a while. And so we got up that morning, and it's almost impossible to describe the relief that the mother in the family with whom we stayed felt. She sat down on an overstuffed chair, and she touched her forehead, and she said, "Can you imagine, every day, my heart, just I want to know my children, we will all be okay." And her husband, Abu Yusuf, sat down and leaned against the wall. He was sitting on a mat. He had one big arm over his older son, who was about 12, and another arm around the 9-year-old. And little 3-year-old Omar was circling, and then he'd kind of do a nosedive into his father's lap. And Shems, their sister, looked so contented, and there was the mother scrambling eggs, and it was just a wonderful scene, really. Now, the young university students who had met us when we crossed, at some risk to themselves, because we were Westerners, and, you know, they were not part of Hamas, to be honest, and so why are they shepherding these Westerners around? But they agreed that they should retrace their route to go to their own university, and we got the most gruff cab driver I've ever met, Nabil, and we got in his station wagon, and in spite of horrendous roads that had been bombed, and there were lots of berms built up, and checkpoints that had been abandoned but still were pretty difficult to navigate around, we found ourselves moving toward Gaza City. And the 3 university students were stunned, murmuring. We did not understand the damage would be this bad. And they certainly weren't ready to say victory. In fact, they almost spat the word out in Arabic. Intisar? This is victory?